So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim.
Hello, everyone.
And welcome to the Holy Watermelon Podcast.
My name is Katie.
I'm Preston.
And what are we talking about today? We have a new series. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
2021. Let's hope it's better for everyone than 2020 was. We have a new series, I guess. Mini-series starting?
I guess.
Let's talk about what we're doing.
We're going to take a dive. Not a super deep dive, because there's an awful lot of depth to every religion, but we're going to take a reasonably deep dive into the biggest of the world religions, and then maybe we'll take a look at some of the smaller ones later too. So we're going to start with Judaism.
Cool. So today we're talking about Judaism, because it's the first chronologically in the Abrahamic religion, faith.
Yeah.
So it seems like a good place to start.
Yeah. It's like most religions, it's kind of tricky. It's not monolithic. There's not a pope who's in charge of all of the Jews, for example. But there's one unifying detail that they all adhere to some degree or another to the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition of the good old Holy Land. So
let's start with how it started. Some of I guess it starts with Exodus. And maybe you want to talk about this briefly, the story of Exodus. And I don't know what you know about who wrote that story down.
I don't think anybody knows who wrote that story down. There's an awful lot of people who genuinely believe that Moses wrote all 5 of the books ascribed to him in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. But there's also a handful of clues in there that say that it was written much later. That's not to say that Moses couldn't have written down some of it, but there's not a whole lot of evidence for that either. It's a large collection of books. The Exodus, which is probably the second most read of the 5 books of Moses, because nobody reads Leviticus or Deuteronomy or Numbers. The names are intimidating, and the content is incredibly dry. But Exodus is the exciting story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And, of course, Genesis tells the story of how the nation, the people of Israel, came to be. So those 2 books get an awful lot of credit, and the other 3 are forgotten. And so the Exodus, the foundational story of who Israelites are as a freed people, is hugely important to their identity. It's about Moses being born into slavery and then being thrown into a river in a handy-dandy boat so he doesn't drown and sink, which is super important if you want a nation to survive.
You can buy Moses baskets for your kids. They're called Moses baskets.
Of course.
I don't know what convenience they are. They're not.
I don't recommend trying to use them in that way, though I haven't looked at them to see if they do float.
Don't ship down your kid, but why would you carry your kid like that?
I don't know. It's kind of weird.
Especially, they're not safe like a car seat. They're not comfortable like a bassinet. I don't know why you would want one. But there you go. Fun fact for the world. You can buy a Moses basket for your baby.
Yeah. And so the story that we have in Exodus of that transference from one family to another is reminiscent a lot of the story of Noah and the Ark. One of the stories probably influenced the way the other was told, at least a little bit, because storytelling just is subject to that feature. And then Moses grows up in the royal court in Egypt. And at age 40, after probably having been married and initiated into the Egyptian cults and whatnot, he kills a dude for being super rude to some Israelite slaves and realizes, oh crap, this is a crime, because they actually had decent laws protecting their slaves, but also you can't kill another Egyptian, especially when he's not a slave.
I mean, that rule still applies, I think.
I think mostly. I mean, the world's getting weirder, but generally...
Don't kill Egyptians.
Yeah,
Or anyone.
or your own countrymen.
Or
In
anyone.
Canada, if you kill a foreign national, about half of our country is probably going to cheer you on. Things are kind of weird. But a Canadian citizen is a big no-no for the murder in Canada. So Moses flees off into the wilderness at age 40, leaving his family behind. He most certainly had wife and children at that age. Being a prince in the royal court at 40 and single would have been unheard of. And takes off, finds this new family. A Midianite priest offers his daughter to be Moses' new wife, and Moses starts a new family, lives with them for 40 years.
Did he leave for a pack of smokes and never come back?
I don't think he had time to give the pack of smokes excuse to the kids. He just disappeared. Of course, I mean, he could have been on literally any errand when he was catching this Egyptian beating a Hebrew in the streets. And yeah, any excuse could have been given at that time, I guess. And then after 40 years in the desert with this Midianite family, Midianites are also descendants of Abraham. So they're like cousin-ish. Because we're not really very many generations from Abraham with Moses himself. So reasonably distant cousin, but close enough that you totally would have shown up to the same family reunion if that was a thing.
3,000-year-old family reunion. Love it. Probably
Right.
older, 4,000. How long?
This is about 3,000 years ago. Well, 3.5 maybe.
Okay.
I mean, archaeology is kind of rough on this one, on the exact dating of it. And so at age 80, Moses is like just doing his business, taking care of the flocks. Also, his father-in-law is still around, so that's kind of cool. People live to be really old in these Bible stories.
Right.
Honestly, the number 80, it's kind of sketchy.
More like 30.
I mean, we don't know for sure. They say he was 40 when he left Egypt. He probably wasn't younger than 30 to get a number like 40, but we keep stacking 40 years and 40 years and 40 years for Moses. It's kind of suspect, but I mean, we straight up don't know.
This might be a completely... Were we still tracking time like we do now?
Yeah, pretty much.
So there are still 12 months in a year and 30 days in a month and 24 hours in a day?
24 hours in a day, I think, is a Babylonian thing, if I remember correctly.
Because I know we have
And 30 months.
July and August because of Julius and Augustus.
Yeah, the
So when were
Roman,
those added?
the Roman
3?
calendar was 10 months for a long time. The Israelites were pretty committed to a 12-month calendar that occasionally threw in a 13th month. Rather than a leap day like we have to adjust their calendar, they added just a whole month because every month you couldn't add a day. Yeah, it was kind of weird.
I'm just curious if that's why they got so old in the Bible, is because the year was only 6 months.
They definitely would have had some serious problems with the harvest scheduling and
fair.
the sacrifices that went with those if they shifted through the year too much.
Mm-hmm.
So the years were still more or less
What we have
years.
now.
Sometimes they were a little bit shorter, sometimes they were a little longer to counteract the shorter ones. And so at 80, Moses, dealing with the sheep, sees this fire up in the mountain, and it's like, that bush is on fire, but as he gets closer, he realizes it's not burning away. The narrative there seems a little bit weird to me. Like, fires happen. Maybe he was worried about a camper or somebody who was like squatting. I don't know. Either way, he goes up in the mountain, sees this burning bush, and then talks to God, is the story.
Wow.
And then,
High as a kite.
I mean, there's not a whole lot of concrete proof to say that he was of sound mind at the time. In fact, I can't remember the name of the movie. It's got Christian Bale as Moses.
I'm Moses.
It's a reasonably enjoyable movie. God is portrayed by a child in the film, and Moses looks like a crazy person about half of the time. I don't know if that's a directorial choice or an actor's choice. Christian Bale is a very talented actor.
But frequently looks crazy.
Absolutely.
like going through his filmography in my mind, and I'm like, I can't think of a time he acted like a normal human.
There were a few instances as Bruce Wayne in Batman Begins where he pulled off being a reasonably balanced playboy. A couple of scenes.
And I just feel like reasonably balanced and playboy shouldn't go together, but carry on.
Yeah.
Burning bush, high as a kite, talks to God.
Yeah. And God tells him, your people are slaves in Egypt and you need to free them. Moses is like, no, I can't do it. And God's like, don't worry, we're going to make this happen. Basically forces Moses into this situation that he doesn't like. And then
God
Moses,
wouldn't do that.
Right.
He didn't do it to Abraham.
Right.
Or Jesus.
Yeah. God puts people in tough situations all the time.
Oh.
And to save a nation, why not?
Okay.
So Moses goes back to Egypt meets up with his brother Aaron, who's a few years older than him, and his older sister. And they show up to the Pharaoh's court. Presumably at this point, the Pharaoh is his brother, his adopted brother, rather than his father. The Prince of Egypt is doing a pretty good job of ingraining that tradition in people's minds. Decent movie. DreamWorks did some great work there. Yeah, so they went back to Egypt and they say, hey, let my people go. And eventually they do. After the Pharaoh says, no plagues, no more plagues, no more plagues, stop it, no more plagues, worse plagues. Eventually, God just kills all the firstborn in Egypt. Probably not the whole kingdom, but, I mean, realistically, more likely a small, isolated place like the lower part of the capital city, maybe. There's loads of guesses on that one. We don't really know what the story is trying to communicate there, but an awful lot of the firstborn in Egypt are killed, including the Pharaoh's own son. And then he says, fine, go. And the Israelites hightail it out of Egypt, taking loads of gold and jewelry and precious things with them. They leave very rich, which is a very bad thing for Egypt. And so the Pharaoh chases them, and as they cross the Red Sea, the Pharaoh's army gets drowned out by the ocean.
I don't think it needs explanation, but in my readings for this, that the Red Sea becomes the Red Sea, which is what most people are familiar with. That wasn't a misspeak by Preston. It was the Red Sea.
So it's a tricky thing that
Interesting.
We know the story was telling about the crossing of the Red Sea, and the story shifted to the Red Sea, but they are actually two different bodies of water.
Interesting. Was that for... Does the Red Sea exist? Do we know where it is? Because we know the Red Sea.
It's part of the Nile Delta, if I remember correctly.
I was just wondering for archaeological proof. They're like, no, they meant red, which it's right here. It happened. I was wondering if that was the reason for the change, if they are two different bodies, which I didn't realize.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing that stories do over time as they change to become more awesome.
Grand.
The Red Sea is
dinky little.
It's a decent bit of water, but it's not the Red Sea.
It doesn't show up on maps like the Red Sea does.
It won't be on your globe the way the Red Sea is. And so then the Israelites wander around in the desert for 40 years. If you check a map, you can see that you could make that walk in about 2 weeks. So the big question is, why did it take 40 years?
Zigzagging.
So much zigzagging, so much camping and avoiding going to the Holy Land for decades. So right after they leave Egypt, Moses sends out a couple of guys, Caleb and Joshua. Right. Actually, his name wasn't even Joshua. His name was Hoshea. Moses changed his name to Yehoshua later. And there's loads of theological thoughts on that because that is approximately the name of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so he sends Caleb and Hoshea off to go see the Holy Land, scout it out. Holy Land's not a huge place of land compared to Alberta, but it's not a small space. And there's also a bunch of other guys that go out with them. And all these other guys that don't get to be named because they suck lie about it and say, these people are scary. We don't stand a chance. And Caleb and Hoshea say, you know what? We can do this. And Israel, for the most part, believes the greater number of witnesses and says, we're not going. So Moses is like, fine. We're just going to wander around the wilderness for 40 years until
40
all of you are dead.
years.
Yeah.
You can do it in 2.5 weeks. It's just, man, I can't imagine.
They set up camp. They move camp a few times. They fight several battles with other nations over the course of those years. But they hole up on this land that they don't want, waiting for everybody who wasn't ready to go to their destination to die.
Wow.
Moses himself doesn't even actually get to the Holy Land. He gets to see it from a hill, and that's it.
Wow.
And Caleb and Joshua, as we know him now, Hoshea got that new name, they get to go into the Holy Land. The book of Joshua is that direct sequel to the 5 books of Moses because he is the new leader put in place after Moses. And that's basically the Exodus. Joshua leads them conquering all the people who refuse to be good neighbors and destroying loads and loads of people. Some parts of the Bible say Joshua killed literally everybody who wasn't going to be faithful to the Israelite God. And then other parts are like, yeah, no, we left way too many unfaithful here. The Bible is a fun text there. There's claims of they're so righteous having defeated all of the infidels. And then these others just like, yeah, no, we're in trouble because we left them alive.
The next biggest one I think of is King David. And David and Goliath. I mean, that's when he was a kid, but he becomes King David.
Yeah, Israel at the time really wanted a king. They thought, hey, our neighbors all have kings and look how powerful they are. And the chieftain at the time, called a judge usually, was like, God is our king? You don't need a king. God is your king. To call anyone else king is going to spell ruin for the nation. And they're like, no, we want a king. And so Samuel, the chieftain, prays and gets direction to put in this fella named Saul as the king of Israel.
Better call Saul.
Right? Problem is, it didn't work out.
Oh, no.
A little bit like the lawyer. It just didn't really work out.
That's too bad.
And Saul was given all of the opportunities to try and be good, but he just kept screwing up. And so Samuel got this revelation that, no, this is not a good king. But instead of saying to Saul, you can't be king anymore, he just goes over to this other little family over in the Bethlehem area. And he says to the father of this family, Jesse, one of your sons is going to be king. Let me meet with them. And Jesse shows off his biggest, strongest sons, the eldest, and look how great they are. And Samuel's like, nah, they're not great. And
I really hope it says that in the Bible. They're not great. Yeah.
He gives fancier language about looking at the soul kind of thing. And then he spots David and he's like, this one's special. This is the guy. And David later goes on to defeat Goliath in combat in the weirdest way, challenging him, the best of the nation against the best of the other nation. And instead of a duel with swords or clubs or anything else,
Throws a rock at him.
basically just throws a rock at him.
Is David a hobbit?
He was supposed to be pretty young, but probably not hobbit-sized. I would imagine he was at least 16 at the time. So he would have been regular-sized. Regular-sized for his nation at the time.
3,000 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's that. And David also turns out to be a really not good king.
No.
He does all kinds of things he's not supposed to.
He gets slutty with Bathsheba.
He does. He also has a serious problem with doing things he's specifically told not to do.
Don't we all?
So in the royal court, there's always a prophet, a person who speaks for God to warn the king, hey, there's some pretty good reasons why you shouldn't do some of these things. One of those things is take an account of the nation for the purposes of building armies. Or alternatively, counting the people to tax them even heavier because you feel like you deserve more money than you're getting. Problems for kings. David's like, we're going to count all the people.
And build an army and tax them.
Yeah. And the prophet's like, if you do this, God will kill your nation. And then he's like, yeah, we're going to do it anyway. And then huge numbers of Israelites die all across the nation of some terrible plague.
COVID-19.
Yeah, bad things. They had no power to stop it. Medicine at the time definitely sucked, especially in their little pocket of the world. And anytime you did have, say, leprosy, you would go to the priest because your priests were the most educated. Just generally, if anyone could read, your priest could read. If anybody knew a lot about taking care of things other than sheep, it was probably the priests. So they were basically your doctors.
Yeah.
And the guy who's got some sort of authority over all of the faithful in the nation just told you, don't do this thing. So that sucks. Yeah, David just wasn't a great king. He wanted to build a temple. Israel had a very small portable temple, like a large tent by our standards today. And the prophet told David, don't do it. It's okay if you collect all the stuff to do it, but your son will be the one to do it because you are not pious enough. Look at what you've been. So there's a whole lot of Psalms ascribed to David. Some people think that David himself wrote a lot of music that became the Psalms in the Hebrew Bible. There's a perfectly acceptable number of scholars who are 100% committed to the idea that there's, like we see today, loads of people writing Psalms as though they were David. You know, writing from somebody else's perspective.
Fanfic.
Yeah, which is a perfectly normal literary practice that is definitely older than a lot of people give it credit for. Like the books of Moses, probably written by a dude or a collection of dudes, and they were definitely dudes.
Women should read and write, Preston God.
And, you know, just describing things to Moses. There's parts that say Moses was the humblest man that there ever was. It's fun to say, look at Moses awarding himself as the humblest man, because it's in one of the books of Moses. Now, it's written probably decades or centuries later by another dude or several dudes.
You mentioned King David's son and the temple, which I think is a very important point too.
Solomon's temple is a huge deal. It's a massive undertaking that took 7 years to build. And if you were to see the building, you would realize that 7 years is way too long to take on building this tiny structure. You've seen the Mormon temple here in the city, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So the Temple of Solomon was half that size.
Wow.
And it took them 7.5 years to build.
I mean, it took them 40 years to cross a desert. So Come on. I'm not surprised.
Yeah, Israel does have a tendency to take a little longer to do. They drag their heels at this point. And when you read the story, you see that they have a lot of issues with faith. Moses takes off up the mountain, and he's gone for, a little over a month. And in that time, they're like, we're going to go back to worshiping Egyptian gods. We're going to build a new calf out of gold and all this nonsense. Things that really piss Moses off when he comes back down and say, hey, what you up to?
I was only gone.
Yeah. I mean, also disappearing up the hill for a month?
I mean, again, 40 years, 7 years, a month. It's all the same.
They kind of drag their heels.
Yeah.
I feel like we're starting to edge up onto the edge of racist. We're going to try not to do that too much.
So King David's son is it prophesized, is that the right word? To rebuild the temple?
So there is, the son of David, mysterious person, don't know who he is, but he's supposed to be of that royal line. He's supposed to come back, save Israel, and rebuild the temple, or at least be associated with the rebuilding of the temple in some way.
So I've always found this as an interesting fact. So Judaism is waiting for this Messiah, the son of King David, to rebuild the temple. This is this line that Christians believe that Messiah is Jesus and he's already come. So that's the line between Judaism and Christianity.
I mean, ultimately, yeah, Christianity, when it first came about, was hardly distinguishable from Judaism, apart from believing that this Jesus person is that promised Messiah. Problem is, he died without rebuilding or without being at all associated with the building of the temple. King Herod had done a lot of work to renovate the temple and make it up to his standards, or whatever it was at the time. But Jesus was barely associated with the temple in his day. And so both Jews and Christians are waiting for the coming of the Messiah in the future and the rebuilding of that temple in Jerusalem.
Perfect.
But I think we're just moving a little away from our focus and being, as many people are, easily distracted by Christians.
I just wanted to point out that is that line. Maybe the next thing we should talk about is how this materializes in today's world. So the Torah and the Talmud, I am hesitant because I'm scared I'll get it wrong. The Torah is the 5 books of Moses.
Yes.
And the Talmud is everything that the rabbis have argued about and the Torah.
The Talmud is the writings of some rabbis, because obviously we still have rabbis today who aren't adding to it. And there's loads of rabbinical writings that aren't included in the Talmud that are ancient and revered. In addition to those, there's also the other parts of the Hebrew Bible, often called the Tanakh, which is
the other one.
An acronym. The Tanakh is a 3-letter acronym. T stands for Torah, the law, the books of Moses. The Nevi'im is the prophets. You got Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Those are your big ones. And then there's a bunch of minor prophets. And then you've got the Ketuvim, the writings. That includes the wisdom books, the songs, the chronicles, the history that didn't make it into those other 2 sections. And it's often thought that it's like this book, the Bible, is written by God. I think I've addressed this before. People believe it. I don't understand why you can't open the book and believe that. They're written by a whole bunch of people. It's a national library. Like if you were to assemble a canon of English literature, you'd have Dickens and Shakespeare. Modernly, you'd probably add Rowling to that.
Well, and I mean, Shakespeare's even argued that there was no way he could have written it all by himself.
Exactly.
So that's probably a really good comparison.
You look at Stephen King and how prolific his writings are, many of which are not high quality. And it's easy enough to believe that Shakespeare could have written that volume, but producing that volume and that quality level is either absolute genius or otherwise unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And, whatever, it's Shakespeare. We can't say, oh yeah, it was Francis Bacon. He wrote half of it. But, okay, I don't really care. If I say Shakespeare's Hamlet, you know what I'm talking about.
Totally.
And so the Hebrew Bible is just a national library. You have fiction in the National Library. That just makes sense. You've got songbooks. You've got wisdom literature. You've got sets of proverbs as a subset to that I think is a nifty thing. The proverbs are mostly adopted from another nation. And then you've got the prophets, all these people who say, hey, Israel, stop being so terrible. And the nation actually kept, definitely not all of it, in their national library, in a volume that was actually preserved as it got translated for the Jews in Alexandria and across the world. It's kind of cool. But to say that it's one cohesive book that should not, under any circumstance, contradict another part of itself is problematic, and to think that it was all written by God is unsupportable.
Well, that's one interesting thing about Judaism that I definitely haven't seen in other religions in my research, is that they're encouraged to argue and debate. Like, Jewish people are known for that. That being said, there are still, we're going to get into the different types of Judaism and conservative values or orthodox values where if you differ, they think you're wrong. But there is a huge practice of debating the content of the Torah, and that's where the Talmud comes from, is these debates.
Jesus, going back to that easily found distraction, is absolutely the typical Pharisaic rabbi. He argued all the time and argued about the law with other rabbis. Like, there's loads of people who like to say all the Pharisees were bad. Jesus definitely grew up in a Pharisaic family. And everything about his teaching practice and style was absolutely in line with that tradition.
Is that a good segue into the different types of Judaism?
Yeah.
Is that what we want to tackle next?
Let's do it.
There's a lot to talk about, because there's like the biblical side and the historical side, and then I'm sure our parishioners, our congregants.
You guys are probably more interested in learning how to deal with your neighbors of the various types.
Right, and what everyday practices are. And why do they have 2 fridges?
Oh, definitely to keep things separate that aren't supposed to touch or even be stored near each other.
Well, so now let's
2 separate sets of pans.
Oh, we'll get there. But let's start with, unlike Christianity, there's about 3 types of Judaism. I mean, a few more but less. You can break it down into 3 big groups. Let's start with Orthodox, because it is definitely the most rule following. This is where the Hasidic tradition falls under. So if you picture a Jewish person from New York, the only place in the world I've ever seen them, or Israel, I guess, would be the other place.
Yeah, I think you found a lot there.
All of them there. These are the men with the curls and the beards and the big black hats in Israel chanting at the wall.
Yeah. So these are the people who are generally, and I feel like within every group you're going to have some dissidents, but as a reasonably fair generalization, they are super committed to following the law of Moses as it is recorded in the Bible, as well as pretty much every legal judgment from the rabbis since then on how to deal with those laws in the Bible.
My show notes say that they believe the law is binding and revealed by God. So they're definitely the strictest of these denominations is the wrong word, but denominations.
Loose groupings.
Loose groupings. We're going to get into their practices later, but they have the strictest dietary practices. They'll have the strictest dress codes. Yeah. I mean, those are sort of for modern practices. I want to say they'll like something the Sabbath. They
keep the Sabbath holy?
Sure. They keep the Sabbath. Yeah. They all keep the Sabbath holy, but they will take it to a much stricter level.
I'm going to remind our audience that the thing that most of you probably already know, the Jewish Sabbath is Saturday.
And that's because God rested on Saturday. He did a whole week of work, and then he got tired. So he put his feet up.
He took a chill day, and I can definitely agree with the need for that.
The Sabbath, I mean, like Christians have their Sunday, and I think Muslims are Friday. Seventh-day Adventists, if you're Christian, are Saturday as well. The Jewish community doesn't do any work on Saturday. in my readings, it's actually considered one of the holiest days, and it happens every week. So imagine having Easter if you're Christian or pseudo-Christian every week. So they have a big meal, you go to the synagogue, and then they don't do any work on Saturday. And that will vary. How they define work will vary from Orthodox to conservative to Reform.
Yeah.
So with that being said, the next group is conservative.
But slightly less conservative than the Orthodox.
Than the Orthodox. It's the middle between Reform and Orthodoxy. You might see the men wear yarmulkes more frequently, but they probably won't have the curls or the beards.
But they might.
They might.
But probably not in many cases.
That's all I have for notes on conservative Judaism.
Yeah, they're just kind of the middle ground.
They're probably, moderately strict on dress. Yeah, they're kind of,
Lots of wigs.
Yes, we will get into that. We're going to get into that. And then Reform is the loosey-goosey of the three. So they might not conform to any of the dietary restrictions at all. They might not do any of the dress. This could even be some of the examples I saw are like Jerry Seinfeld's Jewish. Like he's probably non-practicing, but he grew up in a Jewish household, and how they define, and this is another subject we'll get to in a moment, but whether Judaism is a race versus a religion, but you are Jewish if your mother was Jewish. So Jerry Seinfeld's mother was Jewish, and whether he eats bacon,
Jewish.
so whether he eats bacon or not, he's Jewish, and so Reform can go into that group a little bit as well.
I definitely think there's a strong overlap between those two groups.
Yeah, or so like me and Christianity, we celebrate Christmas, we celebrated Easter, we never went to church. That's, and then you'll get some who go to church for Passover or Hanukkah, or church synagogue for Passover or Hanukkah, and that's kind of it. And when their grandma's over, they won't eat pork, but if they're out with friends, they'll put bacon on their burger. So
bacon on their cheeseburger.
Bacon on their no, that's so bad, Preston. So those are the three.
It's easy enough for the Reform Jews to not worry so much about those dietary restrictions and a lot of the other cleanliness, purity, ritual cleanliness laws, because the way it's worded in the Torah, it's all about you don't go to the temple unless you are ritually pure. And since the temple has been destroyed for almost 2,000 years, more conservative Jews will ascribe those same limitations to going to the synagogue, whereas Reform Jews typically don't seem to. They just don't worry about it at all, because there's that reason for following those laws is no longer present.
And yes. And I wanted to point out that Reform is actually quite old. It started in the late 1800s during the Enlightenment. So it was a way Reform came about so that Jewish people could participate more in secular society and be part of the Enlightenment and have some of those ideas. Yeah. Diet, dress, and purity are not cohesive with holiness or spirituality. That those things don't have any. You can eat bacon and still be a holy person.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of these practices and rules and observances that we've alluded to, and the degrees through Orthodoxy to Reform.
All right. Let's start with that shock that you had when I put cheese on that bacon burger.
I distinctly remember this from my one religious studies class, and I was very excited to look it up again.
Uh-huh.
So there is a line in Exodus. There's a line in Exodus 23:19. Look at me.
Glad you took notes. So the line.
I didn't write down the line.
You will not boil a kid in its mother's milk.
Yes, you will not boil a kid in its mother's milk. So that you might have more recent information or more refreshed information than I do. But essentially it's that you wouldn't the kid they're talking about is a goat.
Yes, not a human child, but a kid that you're allowed to eat under Jewish law, which does strictly forbid cannibalism.
So they, yes,
Just thought I'd throw that in
don't
there.
cannibalize your neighbors. So that it would be very hard to do nowadays, I think, because dairy cattle and beef cattle are separate.
Yeah, they are.
But the idea is that you don't necessarily know where your milk came from or where your meat came from, or if you were, however many thousand years ago, it would have been the same. You would have milked your goat until it couldn't do it anymore, and then you would have slaughtered it.
It just reminded me of the horse meat scandal from a couple of years back.
So the idea is that you don't know where the milk versus meat came from, or the cheese, or it's meat and dairy that they keep separate based off of this one small line in Exodus. Other dietary restrictions include they do not eat shellfish.
Right. If it lives in the water, it has to have fins and scales.
Both at the same time.
Yes.
So you can't eat a shark.
Right. Shark scales are actually lies. They are teeth. Their whole body's coated in teeth.
Oh.
And sharks are super creepy.
I believe that. Yes. And then no pork whatsoever either. No cloven animal. No. Hooved? They must have cloven hooves.
Yes, if it chews its cud and has a cloven hoof, you're fine.
So you can eat cows, you can eat goats, you can't eat horses or pigs.
Right. Camels are right off.
Oh no, I love camels. So those are the big dietary restrictions. And as Preston alluded to, and again, this will change depending on how Orthodox to Reform you are, Jewish people will have often separate fridges, separate cutlery, separate plates, separate cooking utensils to obey this law so that they never touch. And I remember hearing that if you have had like a milkshake, they will wait a certain number of hours before eating meat.
Yeah, a cheesecake right after a steak dinner is a big no-no.
Well, that sounds delicious.
You just gotta have a little window of time in between your meal and your dessert.
So that they never touch.
Yep.
The other piece of dietary, I guess, no, I wouldn't call this one a restriction, but is meat has to be kosher. Everything has to be kosher.
So the word kosher comes from the word kashrut, which basically is just the dietary law.
Oh, okay. So there you go. Yes, so they have to eat kosher meat.
Yeah, things that follow those laws.
So that follow dietary laws. So blood is not kosher.
Never.
So the big thing with kosher meat is that it has to be slaughtered in a particular way and all the blood drained. And this is actually very similar, if not identical, to halal. So halal, the blood has to be drained.
There's an awful lot of similarities.
And I know in halal, the blood needs to be drained as well in a certain way. Yeah. So kosher meat has to be all the blood drained in a specific way. And then it is salted with kosher salt. And that is essentially how you make meat kosher. I remember asking a Jewish friend what kosher salt is. And he said, well, it's the salt used to make things kosher. And I was like, cool. But how is that different from table salt or iodinized salt or Himalayan pink sea salt? Like, what is actually, because I can go buy kosher salt in the grocery store, but I can also go buy some regular salt in the grocery store. So what actually makes it different? Fun fact, it is flakier, lighter texture, and it has a milder flavor. That really didn't answer the question of what is kosher salt, but that's what makes it different from a culinary perspective.
I now feel the need to look up what the chemical makeup of kosher salt is.
I'm pretty sure all salt is NaCl. And then
there's a wide variety of salts. It does look a lot different from your regular table salt, but so it does consist mainly of sodium chloride, NaCl, but it also usually includes an anti-caking agent.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it looks a little bit.
That's probably where you get the
powdery.
flakier, powdery. Yeah, here you go. So I think that's the big portion for the dietary laws and dietary restrictions. I don't think we'll get into holidays right now
Okay.
and what, because that's a whole thing. But if you're interested, send us an email or DM us on Instagram. If anything we talked about here, because this is really just an overview episode, piques your interest, let us know and we will do a full episode on it. But they're known for latkes at Passover.
Hanukkah.
Hanukkah.
Latkes are I'm repeating after you now. Latkes are definitely a Hanukkah thing. Why do I keep saying Passover now?
Because I said I just remember coming to your house for latkes.
Yes, it was definitely a Hanukkah thing.
Hanukkah thing. That's the big one that I can remember. But they just, like any tradition, they have their big foods that they eat at different times of the year.
Oily foods are definitely a big deal, especially for Hanukkah, but honestly, year-round.
I mean,
Just like America.
I was just reading something about brisket. They like brisket for some celebration.
Oh, yeah. That chest meat on the cow. Or, I mean, also, the horse has got a decent chest, too.
They
but
don't eat horses.
not kosher.
Not kosher.
Yeah.
So some other observances and practices. I feel like I didn't know this until later in life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, being in Canada, we don't have a huge Jewish population, and worldwide, the Jewish population is quite small. But married Jewish women, and again, Orthodox versus Reform, married Jewish women cover their hair. So again, very similar to Islam. And there's a lot of, once we do the Islamic episode, there's a lot of similarities between Judaism and Islam. So married women cover their hair, and that can be with a scarf or a hat. But most often, and this is very interesting to me, is with a wig. So they just put hair over their hair.
Yeah, it's for Canadians in our audience, many of you should be familiar with Schitt's Creek. It's got an awful lot of awards, wildly popular, starring the wonderful Eugene Levy and his son Daniel.
Jewish.
And Catherine O'Hare. And yeah, they're a kind of famously Jewish family. And Catherine O'Hare wears a wig almost all the time.
I did not.
Yeah, in the show. I don't know about real life.
Okay. I've never actually seen Schitt's Creek, so.
It's very funny and it's got a lot of heart. And it's over now.
Yeah. I've seen a lot in the news about it because it's over.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll get on that.
It won a lot of awards and I think they're fairly earned.
Yeah, good.
And Eugene Levy is just a comedy genius.
They're a funny family.
Yeah.
Yes, so Jewish women cover their hair and Jewish men cover their heads as well.
But usually just with in some groups with a smaller hat, and some groups with a hat that covers your whole head so that God can't see you at all.
And then and then again, sometimes it's every single day, and then sometimes it's only for special occasions.
Yeah.
And special occasion can be the Sabbath weekly, or it could just be a wedding or a bar mitzvah.
Yeah. The hair covering for women is actually a thing that's interesting to me. I've worked with a lot more Muslim women than I've worked with Jewish women. And for those really devout Muslim women, they wear that scarf to cover their hair. And the explanation that was given to me was that the hair is just a wonderfully sexy thing, which is a hard point to argue. I must agree.
Oh, thank you.
And that's clearly not the motivation for women, because if you're just covering your hair with a
hair.
wig, that's not getting rid of the allure, that visible thing that definitely works on a lot of guys.
Wow, I had no idea. And then it's also at a different stage. So the hijab in Islam, it can be at a specific age or when you start menstruating. And then for the rest of your life. And then the only people that see you without it, and this is the same as in Judaism, is your husband or men on your mother's side. So that can be your brothers or your mom's brothers, so your uncles, but not your dad's uncles.
Right.
Whereas this is like once you get married. So that's interesting, so until the day you get married, people see your hair, whether you're
it's a little
8
differences.
or 38. So.
Right.
And then the reason for the yarmulke, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I'm wrong. The reason for the yarmulke is to always be aware of God's presence. It's a physical reminder that God's watching you. Masturbate.
I like to believe that a God that is all-knowing
knows you masturbate.
Well, I mean, he can choose what to see if he's all-powerful. And he knows when you're done, and he knows when it's safe to look. Santa Claus, on the other hand, I mean, he sees you when you're sleeping. I don't think that God is so indiscreet.
But ignore our tangent. Don't ignore our tangent. Laugh along with us. That is the reason for the yarmulke. Now, moving on to, I would like to talk a little bit more about the Sabbath, because they mentioned there's different, how do they define work?
Mm-hmm.
So
there's an awful lot of argument on that.
there's and I have seen, I think it was in Religulous with
Bill Maher.
Bill Maher.
Man, I haven't seen that show in so long. I need to rewatch it. We were going to rewatch it in my last semester of my degree, just as part of one of my broad look at religious phenomena things. But thanks to COVID, we had no more classes. And as much as I did enjoy that movie, I did not take the time to go and rewatch it on my own, separate from my disappearing classes.
I gave it to my dad. I could hook you up with the DVD.
Okay.
I believe it is Religulous. If it's not, someone out there is going to correct me. But he goes to a Jewish, and obviously an Orthodox Jewish family's home, and they have like Rube Goldberged up their house so that they can open the fridge on a Saturday, because in their mind that is considered work. So they have like figured like they will not lift a finger. They figured out, like you said, Rube Goldberged it up so they can answer the phone on a Saturday.
Yeah, an awful lot of Orthodox Jews that won't push buttons.
Yeah, that's one.
I think that's derived from, because having anything operated by push buttons is relatively new.
Yeah,
I'm
that was not in the Old Testament.
That the button pushing is derived from prohibition against doing up the buttons on your shirt.
Oh, interesting.
And so you'll see anybody that, if you see Jews walking around on a Saturday or a Friday evening, and that's usually how they'll get around. They'll make sure that their walking is within the prescribed distance because they can't drive.
Yes, that is one that will be followed by, I'd say, easily both Orthodox and conservative, and maybe even some reform.
Probably some reform.
I
would
think
say
they would
not
just want.
most,
I think they just want the day off. Like if they if they needed milk, they'd probably be like, okay, I'll go get some milk. But if they could avoid it, like I'm going to avoid going out
they definitely
tomorrow.
won't go shopping on Saturday.
Yeah.
Or Friday evening, as much as possible, though I'm sure that there's plenty of folks who agree that when the ox is in the mire, you got to pull it out. But there's plenty of arguments against that, too. Sometimes it's like, yeah, it's a sign from God. Your ox is doomed. You're going to go without milk. Elevators, those elevators with no doors that just keep moving in the cycle. The idea is terrifying to me, but if you're used to it, and then you can operate them safely.
Yes, so driving, I know answering the phone is a big one as well. And you know what? On a Saturday, I don't know if I disagree.
Any day where I don't have to push a button. I spend an awful lot of time on my computer and on my phone. My phone has 3 buttons.
Right. There has been, in some of the articles I was reading, a resurgence in the Sabbath. I mean, we're in the 21st century. It's pretty hard to avoid working 7 days a week. Everything's open all the time. And so I was reading that there's been a resurgence of people like taking the Sabbath and just actually enjoying that disconnect time from their phone and from their work and actually stepping away. And I don't think that's a bad idea.
Yeah, there's still loads of places that have Sabbath day laws where you're not allowed to do business on a Sabbath. Plenty of places in America that's always Sunday, but it's still a thing that's observed. Of course, there's preference given to Christians and not Jews because, yay, separation of church and state didn't work so great.
I'm sure in the Jewish quarter of New York, everything is closed on Saturday.
Oh, absolutely. But it's not enforced by law. It's just the culture has so completely saturated that neighborhood that that's the way it goes. And if that's the way you want to live, that is absolutely a desirable way to have it run.
Mm-hmm.
What else we got?
I mean, we have more things to talk about. I just don't know how to segue to them nicely.
Hey, we just bump on to the next thing if you want.
So I got circumcision.
Yeah.
Which leads into bar mitzvahs.
Yeah, it's all part of that law of sacrifice, which weirdly we've only barely brushed up against up to this point.
Oh, you look like you want to dive right into it.
It's fascinating to me that there's so much around the perception of these sacrifices that a lot of people think is negative. Like the idea that, oh no, sacrificing a goat is barbaric. Not at all. Most of the sacrifices that were offered at the temple and the tabernacle before that, they were basically just, I'm going to call them holy barbecues.
Ooh.
Like there were the odd sacrifices that were an animal is burnt up completely as a gift to God, but most were eaten by the people offering the sacrifices, and more so the priests and their families. So that it was, and these were offered daily. There was a sacrifice every single day.
Oh, can we have a holy barbecue this summer?
I think we probably should. And so these holy barbecues happened all the time. The flame was never supposed to go out. And I mean, you obviously weren't cooking meat at 3 a.m, but that fire had to keep burning. A little piece of me suspects that every nation that had a fire that couldn't be permitted to go out had a population that was really bad at starting fires. Can't
population
say for sure.
Katie. Oh.
I can't say for sure that that's the case. I mean, we've had fire for such a long time. We've been good at it as a species for quite a while.
Tens of thousands of years.
Right. But a little piece of me wonders, you know? But these holy barbecues were great. They were well attended on a regular basis. And depending on who you talk to, there's plenty of suggestion that these priests who were meant to feed their families with these offerings would also share them with the poor. So ultimately, these sacrifices are far from barbaric.
I really want a barbecue now.
Right? And so circumcision, going back to what
we started
took me
with,
here, is part of the law of sacrifice. It is part of that shedding of your own blood to bring you closer to God. Now, it's supposed to be just dudes, but for some reason, there are parts of the world who have taken this practice of circumcision, separated it from the religious aspects of Judaism, and have just started doing terrible things to women, which I don't understand how it's validated, and it makes me uncomfortable too. Female circumcision is never prescribed in the Bible and is a lot more destructive than male circumcision.
Though I have read, and in my notes, it has to be done 8 days after the boy is born.
Yes, there's a specific time when Jewish boys are supposed to be circumcised.
Adult male circumcision is very destructive. Don't do it later in life.
Well, the trick is, like, how do you know that, like, you're not going to have an erection when you're still healing? That's super hard to take care of.
Yeah, just if you're circumcised as a baby, cool. If you weren't, cool. Leave it. I was going to say don't touch it, but that's fine. Leave it.
Can you imagine if Wolverine was Jewish? This would be like a daily. Well, it probably wouldn't have to be daily. It'd probably just be once a week kind of deal. Mm-hmm. Having the ability to regrow every lost bit of your body quickly would be a problem.
I've never thought that way about Wolverine. Thanks, Preston.
But you will now.
No, I'll never not think about that. What is the... Oh my God.
I think this is why people listen to us.
The reason it is a tradition in the Jewish religion to cut off foreskins is because God asked Abraham to do it and that he would be gifted a great nation.
Yeah.
And so ever since then, we've been chopping off penises.
Yeah. To be part of that nation, you have to, you're not chopping off penises. You're chopping off just a little bit off the end.
I mean, do you want a little bit chopped off the end of your nose?
Not even a little bit. So it's part of that law of sacrifice that binds the nation together, and was a thing that caused a lot of shame for a lot of Jews, say 2,000 years ago, back in the gymnasiums of Rome, where to be part of that larger imperial community, you had to hang out in these gymnasiums where everybody did so completely naked. Do you ever watch Friends?
Yes.
Yes. You remember Joey's fake foreskin?
No, I haven't seen that. I have only seen some episodes of Friends, but
so
now I need to watch this episode.
There is testament that was happening 2,000 years ago in Israel. I mean, I don't know if it's salami, but maybe. It probably wasn't.
So probably not.
Yeah, that's an important point. I was actually just about to say they probably weren't using a pig foreskin, even though it might have worked out in color. But there was something that was done that allowed these people to mask themselves as being not Jews, because apparently that was the thing they were worried about when going to the gymnasium.
Well, that was, I don't actually know. I'm about to say something I don't know frequently.
Go for it. We'll see where it goes.
Was that used as an identifier for the Holocaust? Because you could just be like,
could have been.
I feel like I should yell up at Brian.
I feel like in the Holocaust, there was definitely some inspection, but I don't think, at least to begin with, many people were being secretive about their Jewish identity. But later on, I feel like, yeah, there was probably people who were checking just to say, hey, because most Christians, especially in that area, in that era, probably weren't doing circumcision on a regular basis.
I mean, that's basically all my points, unless you want to talk about bar mitzvah. Well, we should wrap up with the Holocaust, as depressing as it is, but it should be touched upon and eventually do a full episode.
Sure.
On the Holocaust. Do you have anything you want to add about bar mitzvahs with foreskins?
The bar mitzvahs aren't strictly associated with foreskin. Because your bar mitzvah happens when you're pubescent.
Yeah.
Your foreskin comes off when you're a week old. And the bar mitzvah happens when you're pubescent. So you've got the opportunity to show to the congregation that you have learned stuff, that you can recite your Haftorah, and you say, yeah, I'm familiar with the law. I know what it means to be a Jewish man, or in the case of a bat mitzvah, to be a Jewish woman in this world. And that's what's the word I'm looking for? The rite of passage.
That's what I was going to jump in with.
Perfect. That's the rite of passage in Judaism. That's pretty common in most cultures in the world. There's a rite of passage that makes you an adult. For some, it's... Yeah.
Sweet 16, if you're kind of secular.
Right.
Confirmation, if you're Catholic. Baptism. And baptism can depend whether you do it at birth or older, but...
Yeah. And so sometimes that rite of passage is a walkabout, and sometimes it's a camp with a bunch of other guys, and sometimes it's showing that you actually know what it means to be a man in the world, which actually makes a lot more sense than a lot of the other rites of passage. Yeah.
Yeah, my last 2 points are tetragrammaton, which I just think is super cool.
It's a cool sounding word, and what it stands
Impress
for.
your friends. It's the one thing I remember. And I remember more than that, but can I say what tetragrammaton is?
Can you pronounce what the tetragrammaton is?
No one can. That's why it's so cool.
There's so much disagreement on how it would be pronounced.
I just want to jump right in because it's the one thing I get really oddly excited about. This is one of those facts you need to take home this week to your families and be like, do you know what tetragrammaton is? It is from the Hebrew Bible, and it's the name of God. And the Hebrew language generally doesn't use vowels. Am I
Right.
correct?
Yeah, their alphabet consists entirely of consonants and glottal stops.
And those things people learn and know how to fill in the blanks. So there's 4 letters, tetra, in the Bible, YHWH. And it's the name of God, and we have some guesses on how it is said. The other thing is that it was taken out of Bibles because of the law that you don't take the Lord's name in vain. So you can actually...
It's kind of true.
Kind of true. Well, correct. Let me finish my thought, and then you can come back and correct me. So I have heard that they've taken it out of later versions that whatever, take the Lord's name in vain. If you're not actually his name, it's just whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You're dissing God, which is okay because that's the title, not his name.
Mm-hmm.
The closest pronunciation we have, originally we thought it was Jehovah.
Yeah, for a long time, English scholars were committed to Jehovah.
And now we think it's closer to Yahweh. So we've probably heard both if you're moderately interested in religion, which I presume you are because you're listening to this podcast. So Jehovah, because that's the older one, but now we agree upon, air quotes, Yahweh.
Yahweh is pretty widely used right now, yeah. There's still argument on whether or not that W should have been a V like it was in earlier
Jehovah.
English texts, but everybody who is at all concerned with the actual Hebrew alphabet knows that the Yod does not make a J sound.
There you go.
The J is a weird detail of Western Europe English.
So even Yehovah would be closer than
Jehovah is definitely more correct than Jehovah. But there's some pretty old texts in Greek that look like they're saying Yehovah. So there will probably always be a huge disagreement on the pronunciation of the name.
Because we'll never know.
And it's nice that Greek uses vowels, and Old Hebrew, we've added vowels since then to that text. So what you said about the word being taken out of the Bible, kind of true. The practice of reading the Hebrew Bible, you would substitute a different word instead of saying the name of God. Usually when you see it in print, it'll be replaced with Lord as the Greek Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, straight up did cut the word that was the name of God and replaced it with Kyrie, which is Lord, in almost every instance, which is I think it's the reason why the King James Version only says the name of God 2 or 3 times, instead replacing it every time with Lord. And the Stone edition of the Tanakh that I have replaces it with Hashem, which is just a Hebrew word that means the name, which is perfectly reasonable and lets you know that it wasn't saying Lord, because there's also plenty of times where it straight up uses the Hebrew word for Lord in the Hebrew Bible. So using Hashem avoids an awful lot of ambiguity, I guess. It's kind of a nifty thing. That's my field. Before I started going to school, I was actually a translator for biblical texts. So it's a field where I've got a little bit of passion and a fair bit of experience.
And that's why I trust you.
Good enough for me. My degree that actually validates work doesn't mean anything. It's the experience I had without any proper education.
I trust you for both reasons.
Sounds good.
I know you keep me on the straight and narrow.
I try.
When I spew things I think are true and might not actually be. I do my best.
Yeah.
I just want you all to know
Well, what
that.
you said was mostly true. There was just a little detail that was requiring a little tweaking. That's all.
So, unfortunately, to wrap up this episode, we're going to get a little dark and gloomy.
Some little more modern history.
I don't think we can talk about Judaism without talking about the Holocaust. But we're over an hour into recording, so we will do a full episode on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and how the history of anti-Semitism, which has been around for a long time, far longer than when the Holocaust happened. So my research has said anywhere between 6 and 11 million Jewish people died during the Holocaust. And just recently, like in the last 10 years, their population has finally recovered. So it's back to pre-World War II levels. It is still the smallest of the Abrahamic religions with about 16 million observant, whereas Islam and Christianity are in the billions of people.
Yeah. There's more Mormons, according to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints official records, than there are Jews, according to these estimates. Now, of course, the number of Mormons is a lot smaller than reported numbers, just because you've got loads of people who
on the books
joined and then literally never showed up to church again.
So the Holocaust, for lack of a better word, was interesting.
Yeah, it was.
Because Judaism is interesting because there is this sort of blend of, is it a race or is it a religion? And the Holocaust definitely affected the Jewish race, which I don't like to say because it is very much a religion.
But they were targeted because of their race.
Because of their race. And Judaism, again, is unique in the Abrahamic religions because it's not evangelical. They don't actively recruit. It's very hard to join. You can join, and there are Jewish people of all races. But because, like I said, they don't actively recruit, and it's passed down from mother to her children, it kind of forms along racial lines, just like Christianity is predominantly white. And Islam is kind of Arabic and Middle Eastern and Far Eastern, North African. The Holocaust, Hitler and the Nazis were trying to exterminate the Jewish race, so they didn't care if you were Orthodox or Reform. If you had any, air quotes, Jewish blood in you.
If you weren't part of the master race, you weren't any good, which is super weird to me. Honestly, if you want to create the master race, to create a master race, you don't pick an existing race. All of the people on this planet suck to one degree or another. Let's be real. As groups, we definitely suck. Look at the way we treat each other.
Right.
But to create a master race, you need to amalgamate all of the best parts of all of the different races. For example, all of the fastest sprinters, for as long as I can remember, Kenyan, or at least in that neighborhood of Africa. So maybe the master race should be at least a little bit darker. We need to be better runners. I say we, that's wildly terrible. Because I definitely don't fit into this category of what I've just described as what would be the master race.
And throw in some Dutch because they're so tall.
Sure, yeah.
Love that. Those are the elements off the top of my head. That are like
run fast and be tall.
That are just like...
So just Kenyans then, because they're tall too.
So there we go. Kenyans are
the master
race. Perfect. Done. Uh-oh. We started it, Janice.
I hope we haven't caused any of our parishioners to make plans on genocide. That would be a problem, and I claim no credit or responsibility for the actions of other people.
Me neither. See, we laugh through difficult things like the Holocaust.
You have to sometimes. Don't laugh about the Holocaust, but find a reason to laugh through the suffering, and you're going to be healthier.
Of it. I mean, I don't know how much there is to touch on, especially in this overview episode, sort of the religious aspect of the Holocaust, besides that they were exterminated at a very high rate. I know that there are some lasting effects. Like I said, the population has just recovered, but
thanks to the First and Second World Wars, Israel has a homeland again. Thanks to the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, England took over Palestine. It was called British Palestine for a while. And then in the 40s, I want to say, I could be wrong, it might have been later, the Queen said, this land, or actually realistically, it totally could have been just the prime minister. But I feel like the queen had to sign off on this, and she's of greater authority, so I like to give her credit. Either way, British Palestine was made into a new nation of Israel, more or less upon the historical boundaries of what we just kind of accept old Israel was. And then you got Jordan and Lebanon and West Bank. There we go. And so these nations are built up and finally gave Israel a home again, which was nice because they'd been having a pretty hard time there. Since the time of the Crusades, Christians and Muslims have been fighting over that land for a long time, and now to have it
still fighting.
Yeah,
the Israel-Palestine issue might actually be an episode.
Yeah, I don't really want to take up our time for this topic with what will definitely be a political discussion.
Oh, okay. I don't know what side you're on. So we better talk about that one before we go on air.
No, I want to surprise you with my opinions on that one.
Oh dear.
I don't think you'll be unpleasantly surprised.
We agree on a lot of things. So, yes, the nation of Israel was created. One ramification I have heard is that in more Orthodox families, and especially families that, and I mean, it's not like the Holocaust was that long ago, but families that remember either parents or grandparents going through it, there is a lot of pressure to stay in Judaism.
We died for our faith. Don't you dare leave. Yeah.
So in some cases, bordering on cult-like pressure to stay. Obviously, that's not a generalization. Not all Jewish people are like that, but that is.
It's a thing that does.
That's a thing that happens, and almost understandably so, right? Mm-hmm. Watching your family die and be torn apart over a religion, and then someone's like, I'm not really into it.
Right.
Yeah, that's definitely some generational trauma that they still have to heal from.
Yeah. It's a crappy time in history.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a crappy time in history today, too, but it's different.
How can we tie up this episode in a bow? We've covered the Hebrew Bible and stories from it. We've covered...
should we finish with the end?
Oh.
So one of the things that fascinates me about Judaism is the eschatology, the understanding of the end of the world. The Judaism is not monolithic, and as we discussed earlier, rabbis argue amongst themselves all the time as part of their religious observance almost, that there's so much discussion and no unanimous accepted conclusion about what is after this life. The Jewish afterlife is ambiguous and cloudy. Like nobody really can say with confidence what it is. The Bible in the Old Testament doesn't give clear statements. The Hebrew Bible talks about the immortality of the soul and a judgment, and there's a hell type place, often called Gehenna, and a paradise, and there's of course the rebuilding of the temple, which is not actually strictly associated with it, but is kind of connected.
Will the temple have to be built before the end of the world?
Yes.
Okay. So the end of the world won't come until the temples.
Right.
Okay.
That's the promise that scattered Israel will be reunited, the temple will be rebuilt, and Jews and Christians alike celebrate that Israel has its homeland again. Of course, there are exceptions to that celebration, but that is one of those landmarks for the end of the world, is this has to happen before that can. But yeah, what's going on in the next life is still a mystery. There's plenty of religions who will tell you specifically, like, this is what your day-to-day agenda is going to be in the next life. For many Christians, it's you're going to sing in a choir forever, the end, which sounds like not a thrill, but
I mean, y'all haven't heard my singing voice. That would be hell for everyone else around me, unless I get an upgraded set of vocal cords.
Right. There are plenty of Jews who subscribe to a reasonably common Greek belief that you'll be a farmer in the next life and you'll be free to take care of your own self and family for eternity, which
that's not bad.
Sounds kind of cool.
I'm okay with that.
there's no real hard dogma on that, which is kind of cool. So, like, you go ask a rabbi what happens after this life, most of them are going to say, what do you think happens? Give me some fuel so I can argue with the other rabbis. Yeah, it's kind of nice that the theology of Judaism is not really terribly expansive, and like I mentioned, there's a handful of things that are mentioned, and there's not a lot of certainty on how they even relate to each other. Like between paradise and Gehenna and judgment, there's seems to be what should be a reasonably obvious way to interpret that, but there's also ambiguity there too. And everything else about it is just like, we just don't know. We know there's a good place. We know that there's a bad place. That's it. We don't know what the good is. We don't know what the bad is. It's probably not a tire fire.
I mean, that's refreshing.
Right?
I like that. I like when people can admit that they don't know.
Yeah.
So.
As opposed to the Catholic tradition, which relies heavily on Dante's Inferno, which is, I mean, it was fiction.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that in our next episode. So if you want to get in contact with us, send us, if you have things you want to learn, suggestions, even corrections, or hate mail, holywatermelonpod@gmail.com. And we have our Instagram up and running at holywatermelonpod. We will be announcing new episodes and some other really cool social media content on there. So give us a follow.
And share us with your friends.
Oh, yeah. 5 stars. Share with your friends. Check us out wherever you listen to your podcast.
By the late Middle Ages, Christian...
Thanks so much for listening.
Peace be with you.